thank you all for the invitation for BMOGS to be here, and Emmanuel for helping to set this up. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. An unfortunate experiment. This is the story which began in 1966 when Professor Green in Auckland, New Zealand, decided that women with cervical pre-malignant disease were at no greater risk of developing cancer of the cervix than women who had a perfectly normal cervix. That, by the way, was the year that Professor Hugh McLaren took me to Birmingham. And the issue then was they found that with cervical cytology, with young girls on the pill, they had a higher incidence of low-grade disease. And it was my job to find out why. Well, I didn't at that time. It took over 10 years for somebody else to find out why, and that was the HPV story. But it did get me involved with colposcopy. So this story begins in 1966, and has actually not quite haunted me, even to this day, for reasons I'll explain to you, but has been part of my professional life since 1966. Now, the story begins with, in 1966, cervical cancer was known to be preceded by precancerous stage, what was then called carcinoma in situ, or now cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. And there had been two major studies published in the late 1960s which confirmed this. The debate was not whether pre-cancer produced cancer, but what proportion developed cancer and over what period of time. So that was the case in 1966. And that was the year that Professor Green believed that women with carcinoma in situ were at no greater risk of developing cancer than those who had a perfectly normal cervix. And that was contrary to world opinion. And his idealism was actually well-founded in one respect, because the treatment of carcinoma in situ in 1966 was fairly radical. And the standard treatment for hysterectomy, and indeed in North America until the end of the 1970s, the standard treatment for carcinoma in situ was hysterectomy, unless you had a good reason for being conservative. Cone biopsy was the alternative, but that meant a large cone biopsy, and as Professor Shaw, Mike Emmons, and those of you who trained in Birmingham will know, that the cone biopsies we took in those days often included endometrial tissue. So they were big cones, but they were very successful in eradicating the precancerous disease. And of course, with the advent of colposcopy, the size and shape of cone biopsy was reduced significantly. And then, of course, later on, in 1991, when this whole business came to light in New Zealand, hysterectomy and cone biopsy was still being performed, but there were other more conservative methods of treating this pre-malignant disease. So let's go back to 1966. And the National Women's Hospital in Auckland, their medical committee, was given a proposal by Professor Green, which simply, the time has come to diagnose and treat by lesser procedures than hitherto a selected group of patients with positive smears. And one would applaud that, because he included in this statement, and treat by lesser procedures, not to treat. His proposal was that only women under 35 with proven carcinoma in situ should be left without treatment. And they should be followed regularly and by colposcopy, and the man given the task of doing this was Bill McIndoe, whose son Angus works in London. And he said they should be followed regularly, and if cancer developed, they would be treated. Now, the criticisms of that proposal at that time were this was a trial. I think you'd all agree that you don't set up something like this unless you can measure the outcome. So it was a trial, but there was no mention of what the end point would be, or how long the trial would last, and at which stage the answer should be read and published. It was also contrary to world opinion in 1966. It was presented to the medical committee, and none of them, but none of them, were experts in the field of pre-malignant disease of the cervix or cytology at that time. And it did not contain an analysis of current knowledge in 1966, because if it had done, then I doubt if even the obstetricians would have said this was ethical to go ahead. And it was interesting that when the final trial came, the government inquiry, I had the opportunity to read the minutes of the Auckland Women's Hospital notes from the Medical Advisory Committee at that time. So these notes that I've prepared here were based on the personal reading of the minutes, and it just shows how important accurate minutes are. And as far as ethics approval is concerned, I think many of us will feel very glad that in those days there were no ethics committees to speak of. Otherwise, much of the stuff we did and published would not have been possible. But certainly there was no ethical committee in New Zealand at that time, and very few in the United Kingdom. And therefore, because there was no ethics committee set up by the university or by the government in Auckland, then the only group accepting responsibility had to be the medical staff group of that particular hospital. And then it raises the question of informed consent, and you begin to see how there are several lessons beginning to emerge, several failures to follow what would be decent protocol, even without ethics committees, to follow what should be an approved form of action. And it doesn't happen today, thankfully, but we'll discuss later, perhaps we've gone a little bit too far. Now, the question of informed consent, I mean, none of us these days would do anything, even taking blood from a patient, unless you had informed consent. And I look at ultrasound reports, and it mentions the name of the chaperone who's there at the time of the ultrasound assessment. And we've gone to those lengths, which you may say are ridiculous, but sadly that's what the public has forced upon us. But there was certainly no question of informed consent for these women who had premalignant disease and were entered into this trial and were not told that they were being entered into it. All they were told was, well, you've got some changes there, but we don't think this is at any risk to your life, and we'll follow you and you'll be fine and you'll be okay. So that was the only consent that was taken. It wasn't even consent. That was the only information given to the patient. There was nothing in writing, and there was nothing in detail. And certainly, the patients were not told what world opinion was at that time. Now, we have to realize that for many of us in medicine, there have been very powerful figures in hospitals and in national organizations. And New Zealand at that time was no different. Herb Green was the professor of gynecology. Dennis Bonham was the professor of obstetrics. And Dennis Bonham worked in London, and on the basis of being involved with the production of the National Childbirth Trust, analysis into maternal mortality, Bonham got the job in New Zealand that Green wanted. And they never got on well, and the way in which they did work together was to keep out of each other's way. Dennis Bonham was a decent man. He really was. And I think that had he been spoken to by someone like Hugh McLaren, he would have changed his mind. But he didn't. And Bonham's way to deal with this was to say, well, that's what Professor Green says. He's the expert. Therefore, we'll let him get on with it. Now, Green's proposal actually violated several things. It included women over the age of 35, not just in his original proposal, women under the 25. It ignored the concern of other doctors that cancer may have developed in some women while being observed. And he excluded some women who developed cancer within 1 to 2 years of entry into the trial, saying that they must have had cancer to start with, so they were just taken out, weren't even mentioned as an addendum. And in 1974, Green published some results in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology, which purported to show that his thesis was correct. And this article, which you can read today, states that those women who were entered into his trial with proven carcinoma in situ developed cancer no more often than the normal population. Now, what he failed to identify was that some of the women who were entered into the trial had their diagnosis by means of cone biopsy. So they had a cone biopsy from 1966 onwards. Their follow-up colposcopy and cytology was negative, so by any standards, were cured of the disease. And yet he included this group in the group with ongoing carcinoma in situ left without treatment. And if you take that group out of his publication in 1974, he could have come clean and said, hey guys, I was wrong. If you follow carcinoma in situ without treatment, then this percentage of patients will develop cancer within this number of years. But he didn't, and to me this always remains as the objective lesson in saying to people, your research does not exist to prove something you already think. The way to conduct research is to ask a question, then use your research to answer your question, and then you can publish your results. But Green didn't do that. He had his answer before the trial began, and he manipulated the figures which he had to show that he was right and the rest of the world was wrong. Now, those of you who have written an MD or PhD, John Studd was in Birmingham at the time. Mike Eamons was visiting from the RAF where he was working at the time. Professor Green came to Birmingham to talk to Professor Hugh McLaren, the name we've mentioned several times today. And he came to tell Professor Hugh McLaren that he, Herb Green, was right, and Professor McLaren and the rest of the world were wrong. And those of you who've done an MD will know that within 1 to 2 years of starting your MD, you know more about your subject than you probably will in the rest of your life. And I was in the position to prepare Hugh McLaren's brief. So that's why I can remember as if it was today the debate we had and in which room in Birmingham Maternity Hospital this debate was had. And it became rather acrimonious, but it was very clear that Herb Green was not open to listening to fact or absorbing fact. He just knew that he was right. I mentioned the name McIndoe, whose son is in London, Angus. McIndoe objected way back in 1966. He wasn't a consultant at the time, but he was the person who was given the opportunity, or given the task, of following with colposcopy. And he said, listen, I know nothing about colposcopy. He was sent off to have a colposcopy course, came back, and he was given responsibility. And in fact, he became a very, very good and first-class colposcopist. And he objected right from the beginning about this trial that was going on. In 1978 in Orlando, that was the 3rd World Congress of the International Federation for Colposcopy and Cervical Pathology, and McIndoe was there. And those of you who remember Dick Mattingly from Milwaukee, who was the editor-in-chief of the Green American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology. John, you knew Dick Mattingly, didn't you? Dick Mattingly was there, and it was agreed that McIndoe, in a free communication section of the FCPC meeting, should state that he had seen women with in this trial develop cancer, and some were dying from it. And he presented this, and I should think the majority of the audience there didn't really realize what he was talking about. And McIndoe, who was at the back of this hall, and there were about just over 900 people were there, he took the microphone and he walked slowly down the aisle. And it was quite dramatic, and he'd created this. And he said, Dr. McIndoe, and he held the microphone up, he said, are you telling us that some of these women in Professor Green's trial developed cancer much more frequently than women who had a normal cervix? And he said, yes, sir. And that's what he said. Yes, sir, that is the fact, and I have the figures to prove it. And that, if you like, was whistleblowing, but not to the extent that we'd accept it today. And it took several years before this finally came to the surface. And the published work in 1984, McIndoe with Ron Jones published their work and showed that some of these women had got cancer in 1984, and still nothing was done. Now, I've mentioned the attitude of colleagues, and we see it today in some parts of the world. Dennis Bonham was the head of department, an obstetrician, a very, very nice man, but avoided conflict. The gynecologists were protective, they were actually bullied by Green. Green was, and I'm using the word advisedly, Green was a bully. He was a very good rugby player, he was a tall man, and he had an incredible presence when he walked into a room. And he just pushed these guys into saying, okay, that's what you want, we'll let you do it. And the gynecologists in this hospital and in New Zealand didn't want to be involved, and many of them refused to enter their patients into this trial. The hospital superintendent, the chief executive in these days, passed to the chairman of the board. He said, I don't know what to do. The chairman of the board didn't want to interfere with clinical freedom, and we still hear that today. I don't want to interfere with clinical freedom. McLean was the pathologist who was working with Green and having to look at these biopsies. He was totally frustrated because he too was telling the board that, look, you've got problems here, you must stop this. And McIndoe, I've mentioned, and even when Bill McIndoe died, the problem had not been resolved. It was in 1987 that a journalist produced a book called An Unfortunate Experiment. That was her title. And she used the word experiment, I've used the word trial. Green denied that it was either an experiment or a trial, but clearly it was. And she produced this, and she produced the facts, as a result of which the New Zealand government immediately set up an inquiry under Judge Cartwright. And that was an inquiry that both Albert Singer and myself went to. And it was quite amazing. This trial, it was in a room not as big as this, not a trial rather, this inquiry. And Judge Cartwright was just sitting at a table. The lawyers were on this side for both sides. And Herb Green was there, but sitting in the audience. And the New Zealand television was there. And every day, if there was something exciting to be heard, then that would be shown on New Zealand television that evening. It was a huge cause célèbre. And the result of the Cartwright inquiry was that an inquiry which was thought to have taken about 4 or 5 weeks, took nearly 9 months to complete. And it was politically a very hot potato in New Zealand because the press in particular were very critical of what was going on, and yet Green and many of his colleagues still denied that there'd been a problem. Now, I put this on because we've heard about the code, the Hippocratic Oath, which we need to take. I took mine first in 1960, and I said it again in public last year when my daughter-in-law qualified at Barts. And my son and myself, we were asked to stand up. Anybody, any medical problem, any medical family there, were asked to stand up and recite the Hippocratic Oath with the new doctors. And it was actually a very moving thing. But the Declaration of Helsinki is also important, and most people have never read this. It says, the potential benefits, hazards, and discomfort of a new method should be weighed against the advantages of the best current diagnostic and therapeutic methods. In any medical study, every patient, including those of a control group, if any, should be assured of the best proved diagnostic and therapeutic method. Well, clearly, it fell short on both of these first two things. If the physician considered it essential not to obtain informed consent, the specific reasons for this proposal should be stated in the experimental protocol for transmission to the independent committee. That didn't happen. The physician can combine medical research with professional care, the objective being the acquisition of new medical knowledge only to the extent that medical research is justified by the diagnostic. A major research trial at the National Women's Hospital. The trial was unethical and led to some deaths. Responsibility extends to all those who, having approved the trial, ought to have known of the mounting consequences. Some women may still be at risk. Patients were not informed, did not give consent. New procedures to protect patients' rights are needed urgently, and a nationally planned screening program to detect early signs. And what was happening is that we then had groups of two cohorts of medical students had come through as doctors who believed that cervical cytology screening was a waste of time. That's had to be redressed, and there are still some people there. who feel that it's not right. Bonham was accused of serious professional misconduct in 1990 by the New Zealand General Medical Council. Green didn't appear because he was thought to be medically unfit. Now, that's the story of Green and the unfortunate experiment, and it just seems hard to believe in this day and age that that could have happened, although it is a long time ago. If you think about it, it's nearly 50 years ago this began. And why does it still trouble me now? Because there are still people in New Zealand who think that Green was right. There are still people who don't believe in planned cervical screening. And there are some people who still criticize me personally for having been involved with this and brought down a man that they respected. So that's the story of Herb Green. And I hope you enjoyed that.